It was a bright morning when the little girl walked into her school. She held her backpack tightly, her shoes making soft sounds against the floor as she moved through the hallway. Like any other child, she came in with excitement for the day ahead. She loved school. She loved drawing pictures in art class, reading stories, and laughing with her friends during recess. For her, school was supposed to be a happy place, but that morning felt different. As she walked toward her classroom, she noticed a few children standing near the door. They looked at her and then whispered something to each other. The moment she came closer, the whispers turned into giggles. She didn't understand at first, so she gave them a small smile, thinking maybe they were just joking about something funny. But the way they looked at her made her heart beat a little faster. The day went on as usual, but the little girl couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At recess, while she was sitting on the swing, she overheard two children talking loudly behind her. One of them said, "That's the girl whose dad looks different." The other replied, "Yeah, I saw him. His skin is so dark. Are you sure he's even her dad?" The word struck her like a stone. She froze, her hands gripping the swing chains tighter. She wanted to say something, but the lump in her throat stopped her. She just sat quietly, pretending she didn't hear, but deep down she was hurt. Later that day, when school ended, she walked out of the building and saw her father waiting near the gate. His familiar smile always made her happy, but that day something stopped her from running into his arms. She noticed a few children standing nearby, pointing at him and whispering again. "Look, that's her dad," one of them said with a smirk. She quickly looked away and walked faster toward him, hoping the whispers would stop if she didn't pay attention. Her father bent down, ready to hug her like always, but she only gave him a quick smile and held his hand quietly. He didn't ask anything, but he felt her silence. The next few days were no different. Whenever her father came to pick her up, the same whispers started. Children made comments under their breath, some even bold enough to say them out loud. "Why does your dad look like that? You don't look like him at all. Maybe he isn't even your real dad." At first, she tried to act like none of it mattered, but the more it happened, the more it weighed on her little heart. She found herself wishing he wouldn't come to pick her up at all. She even told her mom one morning, "Can you come today instead of Daddy?" Her mom was surprised and asked why, but the girl quickly shook her head and said no reason. She didn't have the courage to tell her the truth. Inside, she was confused. She loved her dad more than anything. He played with her, helped her with homework, and told her bedtime stories that always made her laugh. To her, he was the best father in the world. But the way other children talked made her wonder if there was something wrong. Why did they tease her because of him? Why did they make her feel embarrassed when she had done nothing wrong? The little girl started to change. She wasn't as cheerful as before. In class, she stayed quiet. During recess, she sat alone with her lunchbox instead of playing on the swings or running with the others. Her teacher noticed but thought maybe she was just having a bad week. Her father noticed too. Every evening when he asked her how school was, she gave short answers. It was fine. It was okay. Nothing special. But her eyes told a different story. He could see the sadness hiding behind them. One day, when school ended, he arrived at the gate as usual. This time, the little girl was standing alone, her eyes fixed on the ground. She walked slowly toward him, but she didn't smile at all. He bent down and asked softly, "What's wrong, sweetheart?" She shook her head, forcing a tiny smile, but he knew it wasn't real. That night, while she was in her room, he heard her sobbing quietly. He walked in and saw her sitting on the edge of her bed, tears rolling down her cheeks. He sat beside her, gently placing his arm around her. "Tell me," he whispered, "what's hurting you?" At first she stayed silent, afraid of making him sad. But the weight on her little heart was too heavy. Finally, she looked at him with watery eyes and said, "Daddy, why do they make fun of me because of you?" Those words broke him inside. He had faced comments and prejudice many times in his life, but he never imagined his own daughter would face the same because of him. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He hugged her tightly, holding her as if he could shield her from the entire world. She continued between sobs. "They say you look different. They say you can't be my real dad." She buried her face in his chest, ashamed of the words she was repeating. He took a deep breath, his voice calm but full of love. "Listen to me," he said softly. "There is nothing wrong with me, and there is nothing wrong with you. People laugh at things they don't understand. But you don't need to believe them. She looked up at him, her eyes searching for reassurance. "But why do they say it?" she asked. He smiled gently, brushing away her tears. "Because sometimes people only see what's on the outside. They don't see what's inside a person's heart. They think skin color makes someone different, but that's not true. What matters is kindness, respect, and love. And you and I, we have all of that." His words comforted her a little, but the hurt was still there. He knew it wouldn't disappear overnight. He also knew that this was bigger than just his daughter's sadness. This was about teaching a lesson not only to her but also to the children who didn't understand. That night, after she finally fell asleep, he sat alone in the living room, deep in thought. He remembered his own childhood, the times when he too was teased, ignored, or treated unfairly because of the way he looked. He had grown strong through those experiences, but it pained him to know his daughter was now going through the same. As he sat there, he made a decision. He wasn't going to let this continue. He wasn't going to let his daughter feel ashamed of who he was. He was going to show her and everyone else that respect is stronger than ignorance, and dignity is louder than cruelty. The next morning, when he dropped her off at school, he gave her a warm smile and said, "Hold your head high today. You have nothing to be afraid of." She nodded slowly, though her little heart still carried the weight of yesterday's words. She didn't know what her father planned to do, but somewhere deep inside she trusted him. And so, a story that began with whispers and giggles was about to take a turn. The little girl didn't know it yet, but the words her father would soon speak would not only change her life but also leave an unforgettable mark on everyone who heard them. The next few days at school felt heavier for the little girl. She tried to wake up with the same energy she once had, but her mornings didn't feel the same anymore. Instead of bouncing out of bed with excitement, she sat quietly, staring at her shoes before putting them on. Her mother noticed the change, but the little girl kept saying, I'm fine. She didn't want to worry her too much. At school, recess became the hardest part of the day. Before, it was her favorite time, running in the playground, swinging high and laughing freely. But now, the moment she stepped outside, she felt eyes on her. Some children still whispered. Others laughed and made small remarks that stung more than they realized. "Your dad looks weird. He doesn't match your family. Are you adopted?" Each word felt like a tiny cut. She tried to ignore them, but ignoring didn't make the pain go away. Instead, it piled up inside her, making her chest feel heavy. She started avoiding her classmates. Instead of sitting at the lunch table with them, she carried her lunchbox to a quiet corner of the playground. She picked at her food, pretending she was busy so no one would come near her. A few children noticed and asked why she was sitting alone, but she only shrugged. She didn't have the strength to explain. Her teacher noticed something too. The little girl who once raised her hand eagerly in class now kept her eyes down. She rarely volunteered to answer questions. When the teacher asked if she was okay, she forced a smile and said yes. But inside, she felt lonelier each day. When the school bell rang and classes ended, she felt nervous walking out. She loved her father deeply, but she also dreaded the way children would act when they saw him waiting. Some of them stood nearby, pretending not to look, but their whispers always reached her ears. It wasn't loud teasing anymore. It was the kind of quiet giggling that made her feel even worse, because it was meant to be sneaky. One afternoon, she walked out and saw her father standing under a tree, waiting for her like always. He smiled and waved. Normally she would have run toward him, but now she just walked slowly, her head lowered. A group of children stood close by, pointing at him. She could feel their stares burning into her back. She grabbed her father's hand quickly, tugging him away, hoping they would stop looking. Her father noticed the change. He remembered how she used to leap into his arms and tell him everything about her day. Now she avoided eye contact, stayed quiet, and held his hand like she was trying to escape rather than enjoy the walk. His heart ached, but he didn't want to pressure her. He wanted her to feel safe enough to share when she was ready. That evening at dinner, she barely spoke. Her mother tried to ask about school projects, but the girl gave one-word answers. After finishing her food, she excused herself and went to her room. Her parents exchanged worried glances, both sensing that something was wrong. Later that night, her father gently knocked on her door. "Can I come in?" he asked softly. She nodded without looking up. She was sitting on her bed, hugging her pillow tightly. He sat beside her and placed his hand on her shoulder. "You've been quiet these days. You don't smile the way you used to. Tell me what's going on." Tears welled up in her eyes. She tried to hold them back, but the more she thought about everything, the harder it was. Finally, her voice cracked as she whispered, "They keep making fun of me." Her father's chest tightened. "Who does?" he asked gently. "The kids at school," she replied, her words trembling. "They say things about you. They say you're different. They say you can't be my real dad because you don't look like me." Her voice broke as she finally let the words out. She hid her face in her pillow, embarrassed and hurt at the same time. Her father sat in silence for a moment. His heart was heavy, but he didn't want her to see his pain. Instead, he pulled her into his arms and held her tightly. "I'm so sorry you have to hear those things," he said softly. "But listen to me, none of what they say is true. I am your father, and nothing will ever change that." She looked up at him with teary eyes. "But why do they say it? Why do they keep laughing?" He stroked her hair and replied, "Because they don't understand. Sometimes people laugh at what they don't know. It's easier for them to tease than to learn. But that doesn't mean what they say is right." "But it hurts," she whispered. "I know, sweetheart," he said, his voice calm and steady.
"And it hurts me too, because I never want you to feel ashamed of who I am."
"You should be proud of your family, proud of yourself, and proud of me. People who judge others by how they look are the ones who should feel ashamed, not you." The little girl buried her face in his chest again. For the first time in days, she felt a little lighter after sharing what was in her heart. Her father's words comforted her, but the pain of being teased still lingered. That night, after she finally fell asleep, her father sat quietly in the living room. Memories of his own childhood came rushing back. The times he was called names, the times he was treated differently just because of the color of his skin. He had grown used to it as he got older, but seeing his daughter go through the same pain was something he could not accept. He realized this was not just about teasing. This was about teaching his daughter how to stand strong, and also teaching others the value of respect. He knew children sometimes didn't understand the impact of their words. They repeated what they heard or noticed differences without knowing how deeply it could hurt. But he also knew that silence would only make things worse. As he sat in thought, he decided he would no longer let this go on quietly. His daughter deserved better. She deserved to walk into school with her head held high without fear of being laughed at. And the other children needed to learn a lesson, not through anger but through truth. The next morning he woke up early, determined. He smiled at his daughter and told her, "Hold on a little longer. Things will change." She didn't fully understand what he meant, but she trusted him. Deep down, she knew her father had a strength that no cruel words could break. And though the teasing had left her feeling small and lonely, she was about to discover that sometimes one voice of truth can silence an entire room. The father could not sleep that night. After his daughter had finally cried herself to sleep, he sat awake for hours replaying her words in his mind. "They say you can't be my real dad. They say you're different." Those words echoed inside him like a painful reminder of the struggles he had faced all his life. He thought about his own childhood, how kids had laughed at him, called him names, and treated him like he didn't belong. He remembered how lonely he had felt then, but he had never expected his little girl to feel that same pain so soon. Sitting in the quiet of the living room, he felt both sadness and determination. He wanted to protect her, but he also knew he couldn't shield her from every unkind word in the world. What he could do, though, was prepare her, teach her to see the truth about herself and about others. He wanted her to grow with strength, not shame. The next morning, when his daughter came to the table for breakfast, he noticed how slowly she walked. Her shoulders were slouched and her eyes looked tired. He smiled warmly at her, trying to bring back some comfort. "Good morning," he said softly, handing her a plate of toast. She nodded and gave a weak smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. He waited until she started eating, then spoke gently. "Sweetheart, do you remember what we talked about last night?" She looked up at him carefully and nodded. "Yes, Daddy," she whispered. "Do you believe me when I say there's nothing wrong with you?" "And there's nothing wrong with me?" he asked. She hesitated. She wanted to believe him, but the voices of her classmates still rang loudly in her head. "I think so," she said quietly. He reached across the table and held her little hand. "I know it's hard to ignore their words, but I need you to understand something important. People may laugh at what they don't know, but that doesn't mean they're right. You must never feel ashamed of who you are or where you come from. Do you hear me?" Tears filled her eyes again, but this time she nodded with more confidence. His words were like a soft blanket, wrapping around her heart, giving her strength she didn't know she had. On the way to school, he held her hand firmly. As they walked past the school gate, she noticed some children already looking. For a moment, she wanted to hide behind him, but his words echoed in her mind. Hold your head high. So she straightened her back and walked beside him. It wasn't easy, but she tried. During the day, however, the whispers started again. At recess, a group of children sat together, and one of them pointed in her direction. That's her. Her dad doesn't look like her. He's so dark. The little girl felt her stomach twist. She wanted to run away, but instead she just sat alone quietly. That evening, she returned home in silence. Her father saw the sadness on her face. He decided it was time to do more than just comfort her. It was time to show her and everyone else what real strength looked like. That night after dinner, he asked her to sit with him in the living room. She curled up beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. He stroked her hair and began to speak. You know, when I was a little boy, I went through the same thing you're going through now, he said softly. She looked up at him in surprise. You did? He nodded. Yes. Children laughed at me because of my skin. They called me names. They told me I didn't belong. It hurt a lot, but do you know what I learned? She shook her head. I learned that their words couldn't define me. Only I could decide who I was. And I decided that I was worthy, strong, and full of love. No one could take that away from me. The little girl's eyes widened. She had never thought about it that way. But what if they keep saying it? She asked. Then you keep remembering who you are, he answered firmly. And I'll show them too. Not with anger, not with fighting, but with truth, because the truth is stronger than any insult. For the first time in days, she felt a spark of hope. Her father's calm, steady voice made her believe that maybe things really could change. Over the next few days, he watched her carefully. She was still quiet at school, still avoiding the other children, but she no longer begged her mother to pick her up instead of him. She still held his hand tightly at the gate, but she didn't pull him away as quickly. Slowly, she was beginning to trust his words. But he knew this wasn't enough. He couldn't let her live in fear every time she walked into school. He needed to take a step forward, not just for her, but for every child who thought it was okay to laugh at someone because of the way they looked. One evening, while she was doing her homework at the table, he sat across from her. There's a school event coming up soon, right? He asked casually. She nodded. Yes, the teacher said some parents can speak. He smiled gently. I think I'll speak that day. Her eyes widened. You will? Yes, he said calmly. I think it's time everyone hears something important. Not in anger, but in honesty. Sometimes people need to be reminded about kindness and respect. The little girl wasn't sure what he would say, but a part of her felt proud. She imagined her father standing in front of everyone. And maybe, just maybe, the children would stop teasing her. That night, she slept a little easier, holding on to the thought that her father had a plan. As the days passed, he prepared quietly in his mind. He thought about the right words, words that would reach both the children and their parents. He didn't want to embarrass anyone, but he wanted to make them think. He wanted them to understand that skin color was not something to laugh at. It was simply one part of a person, not their whole story. When the day of the school event finally arrived, the little girl woke up with mixed feelings. She was nervous but also curious. Would this really change anything? She held her father's hand tighter than usual on the way to school, but he gave her a reassuring smile. Trust me, he said softly. She nodded, her heart pounding with anticipation. She didn't know exactly what would happen that day, but something inside her told her that her father was about to show everyone a side of him that no one could ignore. And she was right. The day of the school event finally arrived. The morning sun shone brightly and the little girl woke up with butterflies in her stomach. She knew her father had promised to speak that day, but she didn't know exactly what he was going to say. She felt both nervous and hopeful. Maybe this was the day everything would change. At breakfast, her father seemed calm. He sat across from her, sipping his tea slowly, his eyes thoughtful. She kept glancing at him, trying to read his expression. Finally, she asked softly, Daddy, what are you going to say today? He smiled gently and reached across the table to squeeze her hand. I'm going to say the truth, he replied. And the truth always has power. His words comforted her a little, though her heart still raced whenever she thought about all the children at school. She remembered the laughter, the whispers, the stares. She wondered if they would really stop after today, or if it would only get worse. When they reached school, the campus was buzzing with energy. Parents were arriving, teachers were busy preparing, and children were excited about the program. Some kids were running around while others stood with their families. The little girl noticed a few classmates staring at her father again, whispering quietly. She quickly held his hand tighter, but this time, instead of pulling him away, she stood proudly beside him. The event began with the principal welcoming everyone. Parents were invited to share a few words about respect, kindness, and community. One by one, a few parents spoke, giving polite speeches. Some talked about education, others about friendship. But the little girl was only waiting for one moment, the moment her father would stand. Finally, the teacher looked around and asked if anyone else wanted to speak. Her father raised his hand calmly. The room grew quiet as he walked toward the front. The little girl's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to hide under her seat, but at the same time she couldn't look away. He stood in front of the room, his tall figure steady, his eyes warm but serious. For a moment there was silence. Everyone watched him, curious about what he was going to say. Even the children who often teased his daughter were paying attention, some with half smiles, expecting something ordinary. Then he began to speak. "I want to talk about something simple but important," he said in a calm, steady voice. "I want to talk about kindness and about the way we see each other." The room stayed quiet. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried strength. "Every day we meet people who look different from us," he continued. "Maybe their skin is darker. Maybe their hair is different, maybe they speak in another way. But when we only look at what is on the outside, we miss the chance to see who they truly are on the inside." Some parents nodded slowly, while others leaned in closer to listen. He glanced toward the children, his eyes soft but direct. "Lately, I've heard that some kids here have been teasing others because of how their parents look. I want to tell you something important. If you laugh at someone because of their skin, you are not laughing at them. You are showing your own misunderstanding." A hush fell over the room. The children who had teased his daughter suddenly shifted in their seats, their faces turning red. The father continued, his voice calm but full of meaning. "My skin is darker, yes, but does that make me less of a father? Does that mean I love my daughter any less? No. In fact, my daughter is my greatest gift, and no comment, no laugh, and no whisper can ever change that." The little girl felt her throat tighten. Her eyes filled with tears as she listened. For the first time, she didn't feel ashamed when people looked at her father. She felt proud that he had the courage to speak, proud that he was standing tall in front of everyone. Her father's voice grew firmer, though still gentle. "Children, one day you will grow up and meet people from many different places with many different faces. You will have a choice, to treat them with respect or to judge them without reason. The choice you make will tell the world who you are, far louder than any words you speak." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The silence in the room was powerful. No one moved. No one whispered. Even the children who normally couldn't sit still were frozen, listening. "Respect is not about agreeing with everyone or being the same," he said finally. "Respect is about seeing the value in another person, no matter how different they look. If you can do that, you will never regret it. But if you judge people by what you see on the outside, one day you will look back and realize you missed the chance to know someone truly special." With that, he stepped back slowly. He didn't shout. He didn't scold. He simply spoke the truth, and the truth hung in the air heavier than any lecture could have. The teacher thanked him softly, but her voice sounded small compared to the weight of his words. The room remained silent for a few seconds longer, almost as if everyone was processing what had just been said. The little girl sat still, her cheeks warm, her eyes wet with tears. But they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of pride. She had always loved her father, but now she loved him in a new way. She admired him. He wasn't just her dad anymore. He was someone who had the strength to speak for her when she couldn't. Someone who could silence a whole room with nothing but honesty. As the event ended, the parents and children slowly left the room. Some parents came up to her father, shaking his hand, nodding with respect. A few even said, "Thank you." That needed to be said. The children who had teased the little girl avoided looking at her, Some of them had guilt written on their faces, others simply stayed quiet. On the way home, the little girl walked beside her father, holding his hand tightly. But this time she wasn't trying to escape the stares. She walked proudly, her chin lifted high. After a long silence, she finally whispered, "Daddy, you made them quiet." Her father chuckled softly. "No, sweetheart. I didn't make them quiet. The truth did." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. For the first time in weeks, she felt free. That night, as she lay in bed, she replayed his words in her head. She thought about how the children had lowered their eyes, how the parents had nodded, how the teacher had looked moved. She realized something important. Sometimes strength wasn't about shouting back or fighting. Sometimes strength was about standing tall and speaking the truth with love. Her father had shown her that, and from that day on, she promised herself she would never be ashamed again. The days that followed the school event were unlike anything the little girl had ever experienced. Something had shifted in the air. The whispers that used to haunt her at recess were no longer there. The laughter that once made her shrink inside had gone silent. For the first time in weeks, she walked into her classroom without lowering her eyes. That morning, she sat at her desk and noticed some of her classmates sneaking glances at her. But instead of smirks or giggles, there was something different in their expressions. Something that looked like guilt or maybe even respect. One of the boys who used to tease her the most leaned over quietly and whispered, "Hey, sorry." She blinked in surprise, unsure if she had heard him correctly. She didn't say anything, but inside, a small weight lifted from her heart. At recess, she sat under a tree with her lunchbox, the same place where she used to hide from everyone. A group of children walked past, and instead of pointing or whispering, they just kept walking. A few of them even gave her a small smile. It wasn't much, but to her it meant the world. She realized her father's words had left a mark, not just on her, but on everyone who heard them. When school ended that day, she ran out to the gate. Her father was waiting, just like always. But this time she didn't hesitate. She didn't look around nervously. She didn't care who was watching. She sprinted across the yard, leapt into his arms, and hugged him tightly. The other children saw, but no one laughed. No one whispered. They just watched in silence, perhaps remembering the words he had spoken. On the walk home, her father noticed her smile. It was the smile he had missed for so long, the smile that reached her eyes. He squeezed her hand gently and asked, "How was school today?" She grinned up at him. "It was good. Really good." Her father nodded, his heart swelling with pride. He knew the journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges in the future. But at that moment, he felt peace. He had given his daughter something she would carry forever, the understanding that love and dignity were stronger than cruelty. That evening at dinner, she couldn't stop talking. She told her mother about the event, about how her father had spoken, and about how quiet the room had become. Her mother listened with tears in her eyes, nodding proudly. "I always knew your father's words had power," she said softly. Now the whole school knows too. The little girl felt lighter than she had in weeks. For the first time, she understood that her father's difference wasn't something to hide. It was something to respect, something to be proud of. She looked at him across the table and said, "Daddy, I'm glad you're my dad." He smiled warmly. "And I'm glad you're my daughter. Nothing anyone says can ever change that." The following week, the atmosphere at school continued to change. The teacher even spoke to the class about kindness and respect, reminding everyone that differences were not reasons to laugh, but reasons to learn. The children listened more carefully than usual, because they had already seen the impact of those words in real life. The little girl noticed some children trying to be nicer. A few who had teased her before now asked to play with her during recess. At first she hesitated. Part of her still remembered the pain they had caused. But then she remembered her father's lesson. Respect was about showing kindness even when others hadn't. So slowly, she allowed herself to join them again. And to her surprise, the laughter this time wasn't cruel, it was genuine. At home, she shared these small victories with her father. He listened, smiling quietly, and reminded her, "See? The truth doesn't just silence unkindness. It can change hearts." Over time, the memory of the teasing faded, but the memory of her father's words remained strong. She often replayed them in her mind. If you judge people by the color of their skin, you miss the chance to know who they really are. Those words became a shield in her heart, something she could hold on to whenever she felt insecure. Months later, during another school gathering, she was the one who raised her hand to speak. Her teacher smiled and invited her to the front. Standing there, looking at her classmates, she felt nervous at first. But then she remembered her father's steady voice, and courage filled her. She said, "I learned something important this year. People can look different on the outside, but that doesn't change who they are inside. My dad taught me that, and I think if we are kind to each other, we'll all be happier." The room was quiet, just like the day her father spoke. Then the teacher clapped, and soon the whole room joined in. The little girl felt her cheeks flush with pride. She wasn't the quiet, hidden child anymore. She was someone who had found her voice, because her father had shown her the way. At home that night, she told her father what she had said. He smiled and hugged her tightly. "That's my girl," he whispered. "You spoke the truth, and that's the strongest thing anyone can do." From then on, she carried herself differently. She no longer worried about what others thought when they saw her father at the school gate. Instead, she proudly held his hand, knowing that the same people who once teased her now respected him. The lesson stayed with her as she grew older. Whenever she faced challenges, she remembered that day when her father stood before a room full of parents and children and silenced them with honesty. She remembered how the laughter had stopped, how the whispers had faded, and how the truth had changed everything. And every time she thought about it, her heart filled with gratitude. She was grateful for her father's courage, grateful for his wisdom, and most of all, grateful that she had learned one of life's most important lessons at such a young age. It was a lesson she would carry forever. That respect can silence ignorance, love can heal pain, and truth can shine brighter than any shadow of doubt.